Imagine being trapped in a room, the walls closing in as days blend into nights, and the line between reality and nightmare fades. Welcome to the Russian sleep experiment, a chilling tale of scientific ambition gone awry, where 5 political prisoners were promised freedom if they could endure an experiment that defied the boundaries of human endurance. What began as a quest to eliminate the need for sleep devolved into a gruesome ordeal, revealing the darkest corners of the human psyche. Years passed, and the original experiment faded into obscurity, a dark secret buried beneath layers of time. But some secrets refused to remain hidden. A new generation of scientists, lured by the promise of groundbreaking discoveries and unrestrained by ethical boundaries, decided to resurrect the infamous experiment. This time, they sought to push the limits even further, using advanced technology and new subjects. What transpired within those walls? What did these modern-day researchers uncover in their relentless pursuit? And most hauntingly, what became of the men and women who endured this terrifying ordeal? Join us as we delve into the chilling details of the Russian sleep experiment, Redux, a story that will leave you questioning the thin veneer of sanity and the true cost of scientific exploration. I jolted awake to the sound of the steel door clanging open. The blinding light from the corridor pierced through the dimness of our cell, illuminating the tired faces of my fellow prisoners. I squinted, trying to make out the figure stepping inside. It was one of the guards, his face a mask of stern indifference. "Up," he barked. "It's time." I rose slowly, my muscles aching from the hard floor and lack of sleep. "My name is Ivan Petrov, and I am here because I stole bread to feed my starving family during the harsh winter. My crime was deemed severe enough to land me in this forsaken place with true enemies of the state. Next to me, Sergei and Anya Ivanov, a couple accused of harboring religious artifacts, clutched each other tightly. They were caught with a Quran hidden in their home. Across the cell, Dmitry Sokolov, a defector accused of spying for the West, sat in silence, his eyes hollow. Lastly, there was Elena Novikova, a fiery woman accused of spreading anti-government propaganda. Her spirit remained unbroken despite the harsh treatment we endured. The guard ushered us out into the corridor. "Move," he commanded, prodding us with his baton. We shuffled along, the cold cement floor numbing our bare feet. My thoughts raced. What could they possibly want with us now? We were led to a sterile, brightly lit room. A group of men in white coats awaited us, their expressions a mix of curiosity and detachment. One stepped forward, clearly the leader. His name tag read, Dr. Kozlov. "You have been selected for an important experiment," Dr. Kozlov began. "We will be observing the effects of prolonged sleep deprivation on the human mind and body. You will be kept awake for 15 days. A murmur of disbelief spread among us. Dmitry surged forward, his face twisted with rage. "We did not volunteer for this," he shouted, lunging at Dr. Kozlov. The guards moved quickly, subduing him with brutal efficiency. Dr. Kozlov stepped back, his face pale but composed. "Do not harm my test subjects," he snapped at the guards. "I need them in good condition." I felt a surge of anger and fear. "Why us?" I demanded. "We've done nothing to deserve this." Dr. Kozlov's cold eyes met mine. "You are prisoners. You will comply." With no further explanation, we were strapped to chairs and wheeled into another room. This one had no windows, only harsh fluorescent lights and an array of monitoring equipment. They connected us to wires, monitoring our heart rates, brain waves, and every movement. They also pumped liquids into us to stave off hunger, a small mercy in this nightmare. The first 3 days were a blur of exhaustion and confusion. The gas pumped into the room kept us awake, our minds unable to shut down. Sergei and Anya whispered prayers, seeking solace in their faith. Dmitry paced, his eyes darting around, always watching, Elena muttered to herself, her revolutionary spirit turning inward as she tried to make sense of our situation. The urge to sleep was overpowering. Every fiber of my being screamed for rest, but it was denied. My eyelids felt like lead, drooping heavily only to snap open at the slightest sound. I saw my family's faces in the shadows, heard their voices in the silence. My wife Maria and our 2 children, Sasha and little Irina. The last time I saw them, they were huddled together, cold and hungry, the fear in their eyes mirroring my own desperation. Would they be able to find food without me? I had risked everything to bring home that stolen loaf, only to be caught and torn away from them. The image of Sasha's thin face, pale with hunger, haunted me. Little Irina's wide, frightened eyes. Maria's tear-streaked face as the soldiers dragged me away. Were they still alive? Were they suffering? The lack of sleep gnawed at my mind, distorting reality. By the 3rd day, we were all unraveling. Sergei and Anya clung to each other, their whispers growing frantic. Dmitri's pacing became more erratic, his mutterings more paranoid. Elena's muttering turned into desperate pleas for mercy, her strength waning. We were trapped in a waking nightmare, unable to escape the relentless onslaught of our own minds. The deprivation tore at the fabric of our sanity, leaving us raw and exposed. The gas kept us awake, but it could not keep us from the dread that lurked within our own thoughts. The 5th day began with an eerie calm that was soon shattered by Sergei. He began screaming uncontrollably, his voice raw and desperate. He screamed for hours, a sound that pierced our minds and heightened our already fragile states. Anya tried to soothe him, but her own sanity was slipping. Her attempt to comfort him only joined in the screaming, her voice merging with his in a terrifying symphony of despair. Dmitri started talking to unseen figures, convinced they were plotting against him. Elena, unlike the others, wasn't screaming. Her eyes were wide with a horrifying clarity, staring at a point just beyond the chamber walls. Her lips moved silently, forming words we couldn't hear, punctuated by frantic gestures towards the ceiling. It was as if she was trying to reason with something unseen, pleading for mercy or offering a desperate bargain. Every so often a choked gasp escaped her, as if she were witnessing something unspeakable. I felt myself changing too, the lack of sleep, distorting reality. The lines between reality and hallucination blurred, my family's faces appearing in the shadows, their voices haunting me. By the 10th day, the noise, the sheer intensity of our cries pushed us over the edge. Dmitri and Elena, in a frenzied state, clawed at their own throats. I followed suit, tearing at my vocal cords with a savage desperation to silence my screams. The pain was excruciating, but it was a relief compared to the unending noise. Blood flowed freely as we mutilated ourselves, the familiar taste of blood filling my mouth. The silence was worse. It felt heavy, oppressive. Despite our injuries, we continued to whisper to the microphones, our hoarse voices barely audible but relentless. We begged for release, for an end to the torment. The guards and doctors watched from behind their glass walls, taking notes, detached from our suffering. The 11th day brought an eerie silence to the chamber. Our self-inflicted wounds had rendered us mute, and the researchers watched in confusion. Through the intercom, they tried to provoke a response, their voices echoing in the silence. But we had no strength left to respond, only a numbing void where our sanity had once been. By the 12th day, the researchers decided to open the chamber to check on us. The doors creaked open, and the bright light spilled in, revealing the horror within. We were broken, our bodies mutilated, driven by a madness we couldn't control. One prisoner lay dead, her body contorted in a horrific scene. The surviving prisoners, including myself, were barely recognizable. The urge to stay awake, to escape whatever nightmares awaited in sleep, overpowered all reason. We tore at our flesh, seeking to stay alert through the pain. We had been consuming our own flesh, the madness driving us to unimaginable lengths. The researchers recoiled in horror as we begged to be put back on the gas, our only hope of staying awake and avoiding the terrors that awaited us in sleep. Over the next 2 days, the researchers attempted to sedate and treat us, but we resisted with a ferocity that belied our weakened states. We displayed superhuman strength, our desperation to stay awake overriding all else. The sedatives barely affected us, and our violent resistance left several researchers injured. The desire to stay awake consumed me. Sleep was my enemy, a portal to horrors I could no longer face. Every moment of rest was a step closer to the abyss. The 15th day marked the end of the experiment in chaos. When they finally opened the chamber, the horror in their eyes mirrored our own. The experiment had gone far beyond their control. As they tried to sedate us, our desperation turned to violence. The remaining prisoners, driven by a primal fear and rage, turned on the researchers and military personnel. The violence was swift and brutal, a culmination of our torment. By the time the dust settled, most of the researchers and guards lay dead, their blood staining the chamber floor. I fought with a strength I didn't know I had, driven by fear and madness. Only one prisoner, myself, remained restrained and barely conscious. Dr. Kozlov, his face pale and drawn, approached me with trembling hands. "Why?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Why did you do this?" I looked at him, the words spilling out in a hoarse whisper. "We were never meant to endure this. There are horrors in the dark, Doctor, and you have brought them to light." As the last of my strength faded, images of my family flooded my mind. Maria, Sasha, and little Irina. Their faces were my last tether to sanity, a reminder of why I endured this nightmare. But the fear of what awaited in sleep was overpowering. I couldn't face it. Not again. In a final, desperate act, I managed to free one hand and grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor. Before anyone could stop me, I drove it into my throat, feeling the sharp pain and the warm rush of blood. In that final moment, amidst the agony, I held on to the thought of my loved ones. My last breath carried a silent prayer for their safety. And as the void claimed me, I welcomed the end, free at last from the terror that haunted our waking hours. I stood behind the observation window, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach as the prisoners were led into the chamber. They were restrained on beds, unable to move around freely, a precaution meant to prevent the violent outbursts that had plagued my mentor's first experiment. The cold, sterile environment did little to calm their evident distress. Ivan Petrov, a man who had stolen bread to feed his family, glared at me with a mixture of defiance and fear. Next to him, Sergei and Anya Ivanov clung to each other, whispering prayers. Dmitry Sokolov lay in stoic silence, while Elena Novikova's eyes burned with a fierce defiance. I stood before the 5 prisoners, their faces etched with fear and confusion. The guards flanked them, their presence a constant reminder of the control we wielded. My heart pounded in my chest, but I maintained a composed facade. This was my moment, the culmination of years of study and preparation, yet the unease lingered. "You have been selected for an important experiment," I began, my voice steady. "We will be observing the effects of prolonged sleep deprivation on the human mind and body. You will be kept awake for 15 days. The prisoners exchanged looks of disbelief, the gravity of my words sinking in. Dmitry, a tall, gaunt man with piercing eyes, surged forward, his face contorted with rage. "We did not volunteer for this," he shouted, lunging at me. The guards moved swiftly, subduing him with brutal efficiency. Dmitry's cries echoed in the room as he was forced to the ground. I stepped back, my face pale but composed, hiding the turmoil within. "Do not harm my test subjects," I snapped at the guards, my voice sharp. "I need them in good condition." The guards reluctantly released Dmitry, who glared at me with a mix of anger and fear. I could feel the tension in the room rise, the air thick with desperation. Another prisoner, Ivan, A man with a hardened yet weary expression spoke up, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "Why us?" Ivan demanded. "We've done nothing to deserve this." I met his gaze, my cold eyes masking the conflict within. "You are prisoners," I said firmly. "You will comply." The gas began to flow, a stimulant designed to keep them awake for 15 days. As I watched their initial reactions, my thoughts drifted to Dr. Viktor Ivanov, my mentor. His warnings about the experiment's true horrors echoed in my mind, but the state's orders were clear: replicate the study with tighter control. Dr. Viktor Ivanov's lab was filled with the smell of old books and chemicals. "Sleep is essential for sanity, Alexei," he had said, pacing in front of me. "Our last experiment proved that much. Those men, we drove them to madness and death." I remembered the haunted look in his eyes. "But they want us to do it again, Victor. They say it's for the greater good, for the advancement of our knowledge." Victor had stopped and gripped my shoulders. "Don't let them blind you with their talk of progress. Remember, we are doctors first. Our duty is to heal, not to harm." The first few days passed uneventfully, marked only by the gradual decline in the prisoners' spirits. Ivan lay in his restraints, his eyes darting around the room. Sergei and Anya's prayers turned into whispered arguments, their desperation growing. Dmitri maintained his stoic silence, while Elena's defiant outbursts became less frequent. The restraints seemed effective in preventing physical violence, but the psychological strain was evident. Their movements were sluggish, their eyes bloodshot. Conversations turned to silence, the deprivation gnawing at their sanity. The real test was only beginning. During a routine check, I turned to one of the guards. "Monitor their vitals closely. Any sign of instability, and we need to adjust the dosage." "Yes, Dr. Kozlov," the guard replied, his face impassive. "But what if they start reacting like the last time?" I paused, my mentor's haunted eyes flashing in my memory. "We need to maintain control. Use the restraints. They can't harm themselves this time." On the 5th day, the first signs of true distress emerged. Sergei began screaming uncontrollably, his voice raw and desperate. His screams pierced the silence, echoing through the chamber. Anya tried to soothe him, but soon her own sanity slipped, and she joined in the screaming. Dmitri started talking to unseen figures, convinced they were plotting against him. Elena's muttering turned into desperate pleas for mercy. As I observed from behind the glass, I felt a pang of guilt. "Increase the gas flow," I instructed a researcher. "We need to keep them awake." "But Dr. Kozlov," the researcher hesitated, "won't that increase their distress?" I sighed, the weight of our actions pressing down on me. "We have our orders. Do it." Late at night, I found myself in the control room with Dr. Volkov, an older researcher with a skeptical view of the experiment. "Kozlov," he said, rubbing his temples, "this is madness. We're pushing them beyond their limits. You saw what happened last time." "I know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But what choice do we have? The state demands results. If we fail—" Volkov shook his head. "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it. These are human lives, not just subjects for our data." "I think about that every day," I admitted, "but we have to continue, for their sake and ours." By the 10th day, the chamber was a cacophony of madness. The noise, the sheer intensity of their cries pushed us all to the brink. Dmitri and Elena, in a frenzied state, clawed at their own throats. I watched in horror as blood flowed, their vocal cords torn in a desperate attempt to silence their screams. "Stop them!" I shouted to the guards, but the scene was chaotic. "We need them alive!" The guards rushed in, struggling to restrain the prisoners further. Despite their injuries, the prisoners continued to whisper to the microphones, their hoarse voices barely audible. They begged for release, for an end to the torment. In the control room, I exchanged a grim look with Dr. Volkov. "This is worse than I imagined," he muttered, his face pale. "We should stop the experiment." "We can't," I replied, my voice hollow. "The state demands results. We must continue." The 11th day brought an eerie silence. Our self-inflicted wounds had rendered the prisoners mute, and the researchers watched in confusion. Through the intercom, we tried to provoke a response, but received none. "Why aren't they responding?" one of the guards asked, his voice edged with fear. "They've reached their limit," I said, my mind racing. Or perhaps something else is happening. By the 12th day, we decided to open the chamber to check on the prisoners. The doors creaked open, and the bright lights spilled in, revealing a horrific scene. One prisoner lay dead, her body contorted in agony. The surviving prisoners were barely recognizable, their bodies mutilated. They had been consuming their own flesh, driven by a madness we couldn't comprehend. They're eating themselves," a guard stammered, recoiling in horror. "We need to sedate them," I said, my voice shaking. "Prepare the sedatives. We need to end this." Over the next 2 days, we tried to sedate and treat the surviving prisoners, but they resisted with a ferocity that defied reason. They displayed superhuman strength, their desperation to stay awake overriding all else. "Hold him down," a researcher shouted as Dmitri broke free of his restraints, thrashing wildly. "He's too strong," a guard yelled, struggling to contain him. We barely managed to sedate them, but their violent resistance left several of us injured. The desire to stay awake consumed them. Sleep the enemy. The 15th day marked the end of the experiment in chaos. As we tried to sedate them once more, the prisoners turned on us with a primal rage. The violence was swift and brutal, the chamber a scene of carnage. By the time it was over, most of my colleagues and the guards lay dead. I found myself face to face with Ivan Petrov, his body battered, but his eyes still burning with a fierce intensity. "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why did you do this?" He looked at me, his face contorted with pain and madness. "We were never meant to endure this," he whispered hoarsely. "There are horrors in the dark, Doctor, and you have brought them to light." Before I could react, he managed to free one hand and grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor. With a final desperate act, he drove it into his throat. I watched in horror as the life drained from his eyes, the blood pooling around him. As I stood there, the weight of what I had witnessed and what I had caused crashed over me like a tidal wave. The horror of the past 15 days settled into my bones, a chilling reminder of the fragility of the human mind when pushed to its limits. I could hear the distant echoes of Ivan's final words reverberating in my mind, a haunting testament to the darkness we had unleashed. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the blood-slicked floor, and fell against the wall. The chamber was silent now, the oppressive noise replaced by a heavy, stifling stillness. My colleagues' bodies lay around me, their eyes open in unseeing horror. I felt a pang of guilt and regret, emotions that had been buried under the relentless pursuit of scientific progress and state demands. Dr. Volkov, one of the few who had managed to survive the initial chaos, approached me with a grim expression. "We need to report this," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "The government needs to know what happened here." I nodded numbly. "But what will we tell them? That we drove these people to madness and death? That we failed, just like before?" Volkov's eyes were filled with sorrow. "We tell them the truth, Alexei. They need to understand the consequences of these experiments. Maybe then they'll stop." The debriefing with the Soviet officials was a blur. High-ranking officers and government representatives sat across from us, their faces stern and unreadable. We detailed the experiment, the methods, and the catastrophic results. Each word felt like a confession, an admission of our moral and scientific failure. General Petrov, a stern man with a scar running down his cheek, leaned forward. "Dr. Kozlov, do you believe there was any value in this experiment? Any data that could be useful?" I hesitated, the weight of my mentor's warnings and my own guilt pressing down on me. "No, General. The only thing we proved is that human beings are not meant to be pushed to such extremes. The psychological and physical damage is irreversible. We lost lives for nothing." The room fell silent. The officials exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. I could sense the disappointment, the anger, and the cold calculation behind their eyes. They had hoped for breakthroughs, for results that could be exploited. Instead, they were left with a tragedy. Back in my quarters, I sat at my desk, staring at the blank pages of my journal. I picked up my pen, my hand trembling as I began to write. I needed to document everything, to ensure that the truth of what happened would not be forgotten or buried by the state's propaganda. The experiment has ended in disaster. 15 days of relentless torment, of pushing human beings beyond their limits, has resulted in nothing but madness and death. The state's demands have led us down a path of darkness, a path I fear we may never recover from. Ivan Petrov's words haunt me. There are horrors in the dark, Doctor, and you have brought them to light. He was right. We sought knowledge, but what we found was a darkness that consumed us all. I vow never to allow such inhumanity to occur again. Science must be tempered with compassion, with ethics. Without these, we are no better than the monsters we sought to understand. Weeks passed, and the facility where the experiment took place was quietly shut down. The official records labeled it as a failed study, and the state moved on to other projects. But for those of us who were there, the memories lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder of the cost of blind ambition. Dr. Volkov and I parted ways, each of us seeking redemption in our own manner. He returned to his family, retreating from the world of experimental research. I continued my work, but with a renewed sense of caution and a commitment to ethical practices. The faces of Ivan, Sergei, Anya, Dmitri, and Elena remained with me, their suffering etched into my soul. They had become more than test subjects. They were a stark reminder of the human cost of our pursuits. Their stories, their pain, would drive me to ensure that no one else would endure such horrors in the name of science. Years later, as I walked through the corridors of a new research facility, I passed by a memorial plaque dedicated to those who lost their lives in the name of scientific progress. I paused, my fingers brushing the cold metal surface, and whispered a silent apology to those whose lives we had destroyed. Science, I realized, must serve humanity, not the other way around. It was a lesson learned through unimaginable suffering, a lesson that I vowed to uphold for the rest of my life. As I walked away, I felt a sense of peace, knowing that their sacrifice would not be forgotten, that their stories would serve as a cautionary tale for generations to come. In the end, it was not the knowledge we gained that defined us, but the humanity we preserved in the face of darkness. And that, I hoped, would be enough. I was startled awake by the harsh clang of the steel door swinging open. The blinding light from the corridor cut through the dimness of our cell, casting sharp shadows over the exhausted faces of my fellow prisoners. My heart raced as I squinted, trying to discern the figure stepping inside. It was one of the guards, his face a mask of stern indifference. "Get up!" he barked. "It's time!" I rose slowly, my muscles aching from the hard floor and lack of sleep. "My name is Elena Novikova, and I am here because I dared to speak the truth. I spread anti-government propaganda, trying to awaken my countrymen to the lies and oppression of the Soviet regime. For that, I was branded an enemy of the state. When they led us into the sterile, brightly lit room, I felt a chill run down my spine. A group of men in white coats awaited us, their expressions a mix of curiosity and detachment. One stepped forward, clearly the leader. His name tag read Dr. Kozlov. "You have been selected for an important experiment," Dr. Kozlov began. "We will be observing the effects of prolonged sleep deprivation on the human mind and body. You will be kept awake for 15 days. A murmur of disbelief spread among us. Dmitri surged forward, his face twisted with rage. "We did not volunteer for this," he shouted, lunging at Dr. Kozlov. The guards moved quickly, subduing him with brutal efficiency. Dr. Kozlov stepped back, his face pale but composed. "Do not harm my test subjects," he snapped at the guards. "I need them in good condition." Ivan, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear, demanded, "Why us? We've done nothing to deserve this." Dr. Kozlov's cold eyes met his. "You are prisoners. You will comply." The metallic tang of blood, sharp and unwelcome, filled my nostrils. It wasn't mine, that much I knew. My head throbbed, a dull ache that pulsed with every beat of my ragged breaths. Through blurry vision I saw a stark white ceiling, pristine and uncaring. Disoriented, I tried to move, only to find my limbs held captive, strapped. I wasn't alone. 4 other figures lay motionless on similar metal beds, their faces pale in the harsh light. The reality of our situation settled in, and I felt a wave of defiance rise within me. I had always fought against oppression, and this would be no different. I turned to the others, trying to offer some comfort, but the fear in their eyes mirrored my own. Ivan, lying closest to me, shifted uncomfortably in his restraints. "What do they expect to learn from this?" he muttered, his voice laced with anger. "Control," I replied, my voice steady. "It's always about control. They want to see how far they can push us before we break." Sergei shook his head. "We just need to stay strong," he said, more to himself than to us. "We'll get through this." Anya's eyes were wide with fear, and she whispered a prayer under her breath. "Allah will protect us," she murmured, her voice trembling. "He has to." Dmitri, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "God? Where is your God now, Anya? We're on our own in this." "Enough, Dmitri," I snapped. "We need to stick together. That's the only way we'll get through this." By the second day, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The gas was doing its job, keeping us awake and on edge. The initial bravado began to wear thin, replaced by an undercurrent of desperation. "Do you think they'll let us out if we refuse to comply?" Ivan asked, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "They won't," I replied, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "They need their data. We're just subjects to them." Dmitri let out a bitter laugh. "Subjects? We're lab rats, Elena. Nothing more." Sergei, his eyes bloodshot and weary, looked over at me. "How do you stay so strong?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "I feel like I'm losing my mind already." I took a deep breath, trying to muster some semblance of strength. "I've been fighting my whole life," I said softly. "For freedom, for justice. This is just another battle." Anya's voice broke through the tension, a soft, broken whisper. Do you think we'll die here?" A heavy silence followed her question. It was a thought that had crossed all our minds, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. "We won't," I said firmly, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. "We have to hold on. We can't let them win." As the hours dragged on, our conversations grew more disjointed. Our words slurred and jumbled from the exhaustion. I could feel the edges of my sanity fraying, but I clung to my ideals, to the hope that we could endure this nightmare together. The first 2 days passed in a haze of confusion and exhaustion. The gas pumped into the room kept us awake, our minds unable to shut down. My thoughts, once filled with hope and rebellion, began to fragment. The memories of rallies and clandestine meetings blurred into the shadows that danced at the edges of my vision. I saw shapes moving in the corners of the room, dark figures that vanished when I turned to look. I told myself it was the sleep deprivation, but the fear lingered. I clung to my ideals, my defiance, but each day without sleep felt like a chisel, chipping away at my resolve. Lying there in our restraints, the reality of our situation started to sink in. The gas kept us awake, but it couldn't stop the descent into madness. My own mind began to betray me. The shadows in the corners grew darker, more defined. Sometimes they looked like people, other times like monstrous figures. I tried to hold on to my ideals, the reason I was here. I had been fighting against the regime, spreading hope and rebellion through my words and actions. But now, in this hellish chamber, those ideals felt distant and fragile. Conversations among us became a lifeline, a way to hold on to the last threads of our sanity. Ivan spoke again, his voice shaking. "Elena, what do you see? Do you see them too?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound insane, but I couldn't lie. "I see figures, shadows. I don't know what they are, but they're watching us." Dmitri laughed bitterly. "Great, now we're seeing ghosts." "It's not ghosts," I insisted, my voice rising. "It's something else, something evil." By the third day, I could no longer deny the presence of the demons. They whispered to me, their voices a sinister symphony in my mind. They promised power, freedom from pain, but at a cost. I tried to ignore them, to hold on to the last shreds of my sanity, but their presence was overwhelming. In my delirium, I spoke to them. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "To cross over," they replied, their voices a chilling chorus. "You are the bridge, Elena. Let us in." "No," I whispered fiercely. "I won't let you." But their whispers persisted, growing louder with each passing hour. I saw them more clearly now, their forms becoming distinct in the darkness. They were hideous, with twisted faces and eyes that burned with malevolent intent. By the end of the fourth day, I was losing the battle against the demons. The conversations with the others became a distant echo, drowned out by the constant whispers in my mind. My defiance felt hollow, my ideals a distant memory. Sergei noticed the change in me. "Elena, are you okay?" he asked, concern in his voice. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But I wasn't fine. The demons were relentless, their whispers a constant assault on my sanity. They wanted me to give in, to let them cross over into our world, and I was terrified that I might not have the strength to resist them much longer. As I lay there, strapped to the bed, I made a silent vow. I would fight them with everything I had. I wouldn't let them win, but deep down I knew that my resolve was failing. The shadows were closing in, and the line between reality and nightmare was becoming impossible to distinguish. By the 6th day, the chamber felt like a living nightmare. The gas continued to pump into the room, keeping us awake, but our minds were unraveling faster than our bodies. My defiance, once a roaring flame, was now a flickering candle in the dark. The shadows in the corners of the room had grown bolder, more defined. They no longer vanished when I turned to look. Instead, they lingered, watching me. I felt a deep dread as I sensed the malevolent purpose behind their actions. My fellow prisoners had their own ways of coping, but for me the real terror was the relentless whispers of the demons in my mind. By now, the conversations with the others had become erratic, filled with paranoia and fear. "Elena, do you see them?" Ivan asked, his voice hoarse and trembling. His eyes were wide, darting around the room as if expecting the shadows to pounce. "Yes," I whispered, my own voice barely audible. "They're getting stronger." Dmitri, who had been silent for hours, suddenly spoke up. "It's the gas. It's messing with our heads. We have to stay grounded." Grounded. The word seemed almost laughable in our current state. The room itself felt like it was closing in, the walls pulsing with dark energy. Life felt so far away, like a distant memory from another lifetime. The whispers from the demons had grown louder, more insistent. They were no longer content with lingering in the corners of my mind. They wanted to take control. "You can end this, Elena," they hissed. "Just let us in. We will give you power beyond your wildest dreams." "Never," I replied fiercely, my voice trembling with fear and defiance. "Why resist?" they crooned. "You are already ours. Embrace the darkness and we will set you free." Their words were like a poison, seeping into my thoughts, corrupting my will. I saw their twisted faces in the shadows, grinning with malevolent glee. They promised power, freedom from pain, but I knew the cost. They wanted my soul, my very essence, as the price for their crossing. The gas kept us awake, but it also fueled the demon's power over our minds. Ivan's once defiant spirit was now shattered. He lay in his restraints, muttering incoherently, his eyes vacant. Dmitri had fallen into a brooding silence, his face empty. Anya's prayers had turned into a desperate chant, her eyes squeezed shut, as if to block out the horrors surrounding her. She broke first. Her constant prayers turned into screams as her body convulsed against the restraints. "No, get away from me," she shrieked, her eyes wide with terror. "Allah, save me." Her pleas were met with silence. The shadows seemed to converge around her, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. I watched in horror as her eyes rolled back and a guttural voice, not her own, emerged from her lips.
"Religious filth."
It spat, the disdain clear.
"You are not worthy."
Anya's screams echoed through the chamber, a harrowing reminder of the fate that awaited us all if we couldn't resist. But it was clear the demons had no intention of using her as their bridge. Her faith, once a source of strength, had now become her shield against them. "Focus on the others," the voice commanded. "She and Sergei are of no use to us." My body ached from the restraints, my muscles screaming for relief. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the mental torment. The gas kept us awake, but it couldn't stop the descent into madness. My ideals, my rebellion, felt like fragile things, easily shattered by the relentless assault on my mind. I started to see the demons more clearly. Their forms were grotesque, with twisted limbs and faces that seemed to shift and change with each glance. They hovered at the edges of my vision, waiting for the moment when I would finally break. "Elena," Sergei's voice cut through the haze, "are you still with us?" "Barely," I replied, my voice a strained whisper. "The demons, they're getting stronger." "We have to hold on," he said, his voice filled with a determination that seemed almost alien in this place. "We can't let them win." The whispers were constant now, a sinister chorus that drowned out everything else. "You are the bridge, Elena," they whispered. "Let us cross." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face, but deep down I knew that my strength was gone. I was losing the battle. The demons were relentless. In that moment I made a silent vow. I would fight them with everything I had, even if it meant losing myself in the process. I would not let them cross, no matter the cost. But I couldn't help but wonder if I had the strength to keep that promise. The abyss beckoned, and I was standing on the edge staring into the darkness, unsure if I could hold on much longer. By the 10th day, the noise, the sheer intensity of our cries pushed us over the edge. Sergei and Anya had begun screaming uncontrollably, their voices raw and desperate. Dmitri and Ivan, in a frenzied state, clawed at their own throats, tearing at their vocal cords to silence their screams. Blood flowed freely, the metallic taste filling the air. Despite our injuries, we continued to whisper to the microphones, our hoarse voices barely audible but relentless. We begged for release, for an end to the torment. The guards and doctors watched from behind their glass walls, taking notes detached from our suffering. By the 12th day, the chamber was silent. Our self-inflicted wounds had rendered us mute, and the researchers watched in confusion. Through the intercom, they tried to provoke a response, their voices echoing in the silence. But we had no strength left to respond, only a numbing void where our sanity had once been. The demons grew stronger, their forms now solid. They clawed at the walls, their fingers leaving trails of darkness. I could feel their hunger, their desire to break free. They whispered secrets to me, ancient and terrible truths that seared my mind. "Elena," one of the demons hissed, its voice a rasping echo in my mind. "You are special. You are chosen." "You can't have me," I muttered, shaking my head. "I won't let you in." "You already have," another voice taunted. "Every waking moment, every thought you have is ours. Just give in, and we will free you from this pain." The promises were tempting. I wanted to escape the torment, to find peace, but I knew their freedom was a lie, a trap to pull me deeper into madness. Fight us and you'll suffer, they warned. Accept us and you'll find power beyond your wildest dreams. Images of my past flashed before me, my childhood in a small village, the ideals I spread, the hope I tried to ignite in others. I had always fought against oppression, against tyranny. But this battle was unlike any I'd faced before. The researchers entered the chamber, their faces masks of concern and curiosity. Dr. Kozlov stepped forward, a syringe in hand. "We need to sedate you," he said, his voice strained. "You are harming yourselves." "No!" I screamed, thrashing against my restraints. "You don't understand. They're trying to break through. They'll kill us all." The guards moved in, pinning me down as Dr. Kozlov injected the sedative. The room blurred, the demon's voices growing louder as my vision darkened. "Don't fight it," one whispered. "Sleep and we will be free." "No," I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. "Don't—" The darkness closed in, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. I could feel the demon's cold touch slipping into my mind, their whispers turning into triumphant laughter. My body was weak, my will shattered. They clawed at my mind, tearing down the walls of my resistance. "No," I whispered again, weaker this time. "I won't—" The demons laughed, a sound filled with malice and triumph. "You are ours, Elena. You cannot resist us." In my final moments, I felt my grip on reality slipping, and the last flicker of hope was snuffed out by the overwhelming darkness. The demons surged forward, and I felt their presence invade my mind completely. There was no more defiance left in me, no more strength to fight. I was merely a vessel now, a bridge for their crossing. My body convulsed, a puppet under their control. As they took over, I could feel my essence being pushed aside, suffocated by their malevolent force. The last thing I saw was their triumphant forms, grotesque and horrifying, emerging fully into our world. Their laughter echoed in my mind, a final, cruel reminder of my failure. My last thought was one of utter despair, a realization that I had not stopped them. I had not saved anyone. The horrors had crossed over, and I was lost, consumed by the darkness. In those final moments, I felt a deep, consuming dread. The demons had won, and my sacrifice had been in vain. As my consciousness faded into oblivion, I knew only one thing. The world was now at the mercy of the very nightmares I had fought so hard to keep at bay.